highlight, we can just sort of tease out of the conversation, and we'll see where it goes, and we take it from there. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. Let me clear my throat, man. I'll tell you what, I cannot clear this frog out of my throat. All right, we ready?
All right.
Welcome to Friendly Disruption. We're live from iTech. We're super excited to be here. As always, Maggie is here, along with Patrick. You guys can introduce yourselves if you wish.
Hey there.
Hey. So we're excited to have the opportunity to sit and visit and listen and learn from a lot of great thought leaders in the area. First and foremost was Ken Sheldon's keynote this morning, all about tequity, which I thought was a fantastic compound word. Really hits a sweet spot in a lot of my thinking recently, not only from a lens of what we tend to talk a lot about here in terms of access, but more in terms of equity of access in terms of just to the technology itself. I'm going to jump right to the point that jumped out to me the most. You guys can react to this, but the thing that jumped out to me was, and many times we've shared this, I think, in fact, on a couple of our previous podcasts, the graphic of the boys looking over the fence. And there's the one where the tall boy can see the shorter boy has a little trouble, and the short boy can't see over the fence at all. You give everybody a box. Not everybody can see, but you start stacking the boxes differently. You move from equality to equity. He did something there that I hadn't seen before, which was really interesting, which was sort of the idea of laying the Sammer model over the top of that and leaving a blank slide in for transformation. And I thought that was really, really interesting thinking, in that to me, that means there's essentially a blank canvas there for us to create, and it's on us to create that new retransformed space that's truly the most equitable. And I thought that was really interesting thinking, and I don't know if that jumped out at anybody else in the room, but to me that was cool.
Yeah, so I went to his second session, the one after the keynote, and he was speaking about that same thing and kind of elaborated on that concept a little bit. And at the end of the session, there were a lot of key points in the session, and I'll get to those in a bit, but he went back to that fourth quadrant where they showed the boys on the boxes and how it's rearranged the transformation box different. And after his session, he challenged the group to share or illustrate what would this box look like for you and for your students. And I think that's it's really powerful when you can start to think about how you can impact access and equity.
And the other thing that he did different in that graphic, which I'd actually thought about this before, and we had actually talked about it in one of our leadership meetings in Cedar Rapids over the summer, was that instead of in the third, I've seen that graphic where it's got the three boxes, the one with the boxes distributed equally, each kid has a box, and then with the tall kid not having a box, and then stacking others to get the other two children so they can see over the fence. The other way I've seen it is with a chain link fence. And he did it a little differently though, whereas on that third quadrant there was no fence at all, and that's a conversation we've had before as well. And so I think that's really interesting. By the way, I think it's probably worth noting that when I talked about SAMR, I'm talking about SAMR, or it's a tech integration model created by a guy named Hugo Pentadora. Hugo? I can't remember his last name. I actually met him. He's a guy from Central America. Really, really smart gentleman. Had the opportunity to meet him at an Apple event a few years back. And basically the idea is the S stands for substitution, thinking about lesson design here. So if you're thinking about creating digitally rich lessons, and you simply substitute in a technology for an analog piece, like, kind of think like a worksheet, that'd be substitution. Augmentation is sort of that same idea, it's just not quite as, it's a little more powerful, it's augmented, it's slightly changed. Modification is even more so, even more transformative. But the R is, it's totally slipped my mind. What is the R?
Redefinition.
Redefinition, thank you. I knew it was something simple. Means the task is fundamentally different. You couldn't do it without the technology. And so when you overlay that thinking with this access conversation about what does redefinition to access look like, and then this challenge, I think that's a really fascinating question. I would pose anybody who's listening to start thinking along those lines. because that gets into so much of the conversation I know we've had here before about personalized learning and sort of making learning, capturing the gifts of the learners that we have. I'll just put it that way. So.
I think it went to one of the first slides he had up there, which was said all students can learn and achieve when provided with the right conditions, support, and resources.
That's awesome.
I wanted to slow clap. I think Lindsay Spears actually did.
I think she may have. Yeah, no, that was fantastic. And he also had, do you happen to have it up there? Do either of you have the definition he had for equity? Because I thought that was pretty great too. I actually typed it up, but I didn't have my laptop open. So go ahead.
So Tequity is the merging the use of educational technology with culturally responsive, relevant learning experiences to support students' development of essential skills. And when you talk about that culturally responsive, I think that was a big part of the second one too for one of my friends. But it actually goes, the last time I was in that hall was for the Culture and Climate Conference earlier this year. And so all that just kind of plays into that. But earlier you even said that you can't have equity without access to technology. So you can't think
It's
about
impossible, was his language. I mean, I don't know that you can say it more clearly than that. You can't have, equity is impossible without technology. And I thought that's a pretty bold statement.
Well, and he took that, I think, a step further and talked about, we really need to get away from talking about 21st century.
I love that too.
It's not about, we are in 2018, these are essential skills.
Yeah.
And so if you don't have these skills, if you don't have access to the technology to obtain the skills, there is no equity, and you don't have the essential skills to be a member of this,
Yeah, of society, you can't contribute, right? And I thought that was so often, at least when I sit in on sessions, not necessarily like Ken's, but others where, we'll talk about blended learning or project-based learning or any sort of curricular design. They'll talk about technology or digital tools being an accelerant. This is the first time when I actually I can remember really hearing someone take that forcible stand to say, equity is impossible without digital tools. And you talk about a message that's sort of simultaneously thrilling and scary and terrifying, right?
Yeah.
But it gets me fired up. I mean, I thought that was a bold statement, and I appreciated it. So.
Absolutely. So I think about, when you talk about equity of access, it really goes to that, CETA tells us there are two definitions of access, and one is equity of access, so having access to the stuff. And he talked a lot about that today. One thing that he didn't touch on that I was really kind of surprised was the accessibility component, and not getting into diverse learner needs. And thinking about those students and how to ensure not only access and cultural relevancy, but also accessibility for diverse learner needs.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I was kind of happy to find out last week was that, like in Ames, our public library actually has mobile hotspots that kids can check out like a book. So our students who don't have access to internet, that whether it may be transient or just don't have access to that home, they can actually check those out. Especially because we have teachers, when they have big projects coming up, they expect them to get this done, expect it to get uploaded, and all this stuff. It's kind of nice that we started having that conversation then about how can we provide that to our students, so they can check those out from the library. Yeah,
so it's that to quote Buddy Berry, who we've had on this podcast before too, it's that yes and thinking, right? Yeah. And so the other thing Ken pointed out in his keynote, which I thought was really powerful and hit home to me, was this idea of equity being impossible without access, was this idea that, so we're going to tell the kids, you don't have access to internet at home, go to McDonald's. That's not an acceptable response. And so you think back to someone like Buddy Berry, who's sort of fought that same battle. And I'm not sure that this is the end all be all, but taking your Wi-Fi enabled bus and parking it near areas of concentration of kids don't have access. So that sort of yes and thinking locally. That's, in my mind, I draw that back to that same equity blank slate model that he set up earlier, where that's that blank slate, that redefinition piece of the equity conversation, that locally creative piece, and that's what gets me excited about stuff like this. I'll say the other thing that really connected me with the whole keynote was the idea, and it's not a new one to me, but it's one that I've been thinking a lot more about, is the idea of implicit bias. Mm-hmm. And, I totally agree, Maggie. I was hoping to hear more of a sort of equity conversation around the way we've talked about it in terms of access and accessibility. At the same time, I also think that that's probably an underrepresented part of our conversation here too, is the the implicit bias portion of it. And certainly I've been thinking a lot about that in Cedar Rapids. Everybody takes, you took the IDI, didn't you, when you worked in Cedar Rapids? I just took mine, I got mine interpreted. In case you don't know what the IDI is, it's a
Intercultural development
inventory. Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't have that when I worked in Cedar Rapids.
No, well, they also didn't have an office of climate, culture, and transformation either.
Nope.
Probably would be my guess. But long and short of it is, it's a self-assessment instrument that sort of gives you a continuum about how you interact with non-dominant cultures, and it gets at a lot of these implicit biases. And it's a fascinating sort of metacognitive tool because it not only gives you kind of where you think you are, so it tells you, okay, this is where you, because there's a continuum from sort of denial all the way up to, I can't remember that, I can't even remember that, it begins with an A, the top end of the spectrum.
Essentially, I think the bottom line, the top one, is that you're able to get into a conversation with two people who are maybe on different sides of a culturally relevant argument, and be able to kind of navigate the sides, because you're able to just put yourself into different mindsets and situations, and it's it was a great training, really great tool to kind of help learn about yourself. But
yeah, in fact, I'll open up my laptop and I'll get that out so we can have that in just a moment. But the long and short of it is, it gives you not only what you perceive yourself to be, but then it gives you what people outside the dominant culture perceive you as, and that's a really important distinction, because then it gives you this sort of, there's this big difference. And for me, it was pronounced. I mean, I think most people would fall into this. You think you're much more along the scale of acceptance of other cultures than you really are perceived as being. And that's an interesting conversation to have with other people and with yourself. And so I think a lot about his message of implicit bias and how the dominant culture tilts the game continually, not through anybody's active intervention most of the time, but just through implicit bias towards that cultural being remaining dominant. And I wonder about that through access, and then it makes so much sense to me for him to come back and say, this is absolutely impossible to do without digital tools. I mean, I think it's such a powerful message. So I'm going to look that up. You guys can go keep talking. I'm going to get this information, because I think people might be interested in that.
Well, I think one part of that was, he talked about it about giving students access to different perspectives, different, especially when we talk about multiple viewpoints of the same thing. And he shared the story of like his grandfather, who was a Tuskegee. That era. And it was one of those things where we talked about. You brought up the library, like perspective of what, when we look at the books in the library. Who's the author? Who's the protagonist? I mean, do we have a distribution of everyone who's out there? And that's even a thing where we can easily just start getting more access to resources, digital resources. We know our Heartland AEA and other AEAs provide access to that, and you can probably get wider availability than what's just in the physical form in the library. And I keep talking to some of our teachers, like making sure that we're having those digital resources from the start. Instead of after the fact, and that's kind of every purchasing decision needs to have accessibility as part of it, even whether it's just the language arts teacher buying a couple books for a group in their classroom. Do we have a Kindle copy or some other copy of that we can run on a device? Starting from the start, and that's, I think, also we need to look at then different perspectives in the same line there. It's like, are they only from one type of author or one type of perspective?
Yeah, protagonist, the same thing. That's a great point, man. And again, it was just another layer to the. It's not like the accessibility conversation is without its layers already. So I appreciate that this is a daunting conversation, but again, there's so much thinking and design work that has to be done by people putting together learning for anybody, whether it's adults or kids, about these perspectives. So you're exactly right. I mean, so we talk all the time about, at least on this podcast, about, okay, is this material going to be accessible to kids who maybe can't hear or can't see or have some sort of language deficit? But then you layer in the cultural side of it. It adds on a whole nother tier. And by the way, I've actually got this pulled up now, so I do have to share this before we get too much further down. So the intercultural development continuum runs from denial to polarization to minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. And so just to take it back, just to give you some touch points, I was really in the minimization role in terms of where others perceive me, which makes perfect sense because I try to minimize the differences between cultures. But what that's really doing, and it can be perceived as, is a way to sort of perpetuate the dominance of the dominant culture, saying, well, here's how we kind of do it, see we're the same. So, but adaptation means you can actually get in and work, it's kind of, as Maggie said, sort of seamlessly between various different cultural mindsets. And I just think that's really interesting when you layer this onto that. It's certainly something that again, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, not just because of the IDI, but just given the sort of context of Cedar Rapids schools in general. So,
it all goes back to a quote that Ken shared. He was kind of expanding on some of this, and it was from Dr. Imordino Yang. She's a doctor of neuroscience, and the quote is, "It is literally neurobiologically impossible to think deeply about things that you don't care about." If you think about our students, whether we're talking about from a cultural standpoint, or you're thinking about it from, and culturally kind of thinking about students with disabilities, that's where we kind of talk sometimes. I think that's really powerful. If you don't see yourself in what you're doing, you don't see yourself even being able to do what everyone else is doing, why would you spend time or even care to engage and think deeply about it? I think oftentimes that implicit bias that we put on our students translates into what we're giving them in the classroom, and then translates into a student's neurobiologically impossibility to think deeply about what they're learning. I think it all just.
Well, it connects, and I think a connection I make with that clearly is straight out of a UDL conversation, right? I mean, emotion drives memory, drives interest, drives memory, drives learning. And there's no mistake or no coincidence that the first but the first component of the reordering of the UDL model is engagement, right? Yeah. And we all know that. I mean, so we know from a neuroscience point of view that if we don't engage kids, it's over. It's over. And so that layers another, as I keep saying, another layer on the onion of how we need to think about engaging kids.
And 7 seconds. 7 seconds for people to make up their minds. That's it.
Oh my gosh.
By the time you start talking about whatever it is or giving them a task, 7 seconds before they're in or out, and then they've made up their mind. That's tough. As an educator, that makes you bring it to the table, right?
Well, you have to be very conscious of the voice and how you're addressing, especially the students. I mean, I know I've seen it throughout the years, various teachers who they don't have that connection with a good portion of the students because of how they speak to them. The voice they use, the tone, whether they're yelling at them or talking with them, you hear so many great things. Like one thing we keep trying to ask teachers to do is greet the kids at the door. Say hi to them, ask them how they're doing, be interested in them. Don't make it fake because they're going to spell that out a mile away. Because there's there's stuff about that too, about how if you engage a student at the door, just saying hi to them, making that connection, they're going to be more connected to that. And, former science teacher, I'd say we're kind of some of the worst because so much of sciences we share with kids is by old dead white guys, and so how are you engaging that to all students? We've had some big names pop out like Rosalind Franklin, but and George Washington Carver, but then most of it gets washed over.
Well, but even take it back to research that I'm sure many people, and I'm hoping who are listening to this have looked at, which is visible learning by Hattie, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think back upon that work and what gives the biggest effect size in terms of student achievement, so you talk about teacher PL, you can talk about strong content, strong knowledge of the core, strong standards, rigorous instructional methodology. It all pales in comparison to relationships. If you have strong relationships with your kids, you're going to see a huge impact in terms of your effect size of your student achievement. And that's his meta research, all that research about what works in schools. And it's clear that the thing that makes the biggest effect size impact is relationships. And that drives the engagement. So that gets you that maybe more than the 7 seconds, right? You can certainly lose them. You can lose them
Absolutely.
within that.
Absolutely. So even how Ken kind of talked about that was, you've got 7 seconds. And even though he didn't say that we have 7 seconds, that's just research that I threw out.
Well, he should have said it.
But that saying is, this is the way that we've always done it. That's one of the most deconstructive kind of sayings in education, right? But when you think about if you have students that we know that you care about them, they're going to be more likely to care about what they're learning and therefore be more available to think deeply. So it's not about them caring about the content. It's about them caring about you and knowing that you care about them. So it does go back to the research. And so thinking about Hattie's research in the educational realm, and thinking about Dr. Yang's research in the neurobiological field, and UPL, it all kind of ties together to say the same thing, right? Engagement and showing students that you care and you're ready for them every single day.
Yeah, that's the end game, isn't it? And we may have a lot more to talk about with Ken's keynote, but I want to make sure if anybody's seen any sort of interesting tools that have grabbed you, or have seen anything interesting, and maybe not. We've all been presenting and talking, so there may not be anything. But I just want to make sure if there is something that we make sure we get it out there at some point. Before we get too far into this.
One thing I added to my session today was the fact that Google last week released live closed captioning to Google Slides.
Yes, I did see that.
I've been playing with it a little bit. I forgot to turn it on for today. It was in my notes to turn it on, and I'm sitting there as I'm talking, oh wait, I forgot to do that. But the ability that and especially if you have like a little Bluetooth microphone, it's gonna work great, but if you go into slide present mode, you hit the button, the closed captioning button, and then you start talking, auto closed caption everything you're saying.
And it's pretty darn accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw some live demos of it, local live demos. I'm not talking like Google stuff, but I'm talking people at Grant Wood running it. Live demo, like Len Kleinmeyer and maybe it was just Len. Maybe it was. I saw Len and I can't remember who else running it. And I remember watching the demo, thinking that looks amazing.
Yeah.
So, and that's just, yeah, that could be a game changer in terms of thinking about how we capture information for our kids, not just from an accessibility lens either. I mean, the design implications of that are pretty significant.
For professional learning, for
Yes.
a number of
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily have any tools, but a couple of things that I've been kind of sitting and thinking about, really kind of thinking about curriculum, construction, and assessment, and just how all of this conversation really kind of plays into all of that, and whether you're thinking about, how are we providing or allowing students to have supports to their curriculum. I heard Ken say it today. We provide them with what they need to be successful, right? Like with the tools and the resources they need to be successful. Well, what does your curriculum say about that? How are you making those alignments? Your instruction, whether you're thinking about the new art and science of teaching or you're thinking about a different framework, I encourage and hope that you're also thinking about it with a kind of lens of accessibility or a lens of universal design for learning on top of it. A lot of, just as we talked a little bit ago, good practice is good practice. And so you can tie that back and thinking about, specifically I'm thinking new art and science of teaching, you can do a crosswalk. And it's really, everything is similar to UDL, except for the access components, right? And really thinking about how we're providing multiple needs. And then assessment. We in the state of Iowa have an opportunity to have a new assessment system. I don't know what that's going to look like, but there might be some opportunities to think about how we're providing students access to those supports and accommodations in their assessment system. So I think there's a lot to think about beyond cultural relevancy, but that's where the conversation has to start in order to make sure that we're providing and putting our implicit bias across the continuum of diversity.
Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, definitely with the new Iowa assessment, because I know even when we had a conversation in our own district about like identifying kids for ELP, which is our version of TAG, for using the Iowa assessment, the old one, which was shown to be not culturally equitable, but we're still using that as a score. So I'm very curious what the next assessment will be, even if it's supposed to be a digital assessment, it's supposed to be, it'll auto-adjust based on when they put their questions in, similar to what we did this year with our reading screener in our high school, where it would adjust based on the question you put in. But at least I'm always curious about what accessible tools are built into it, since it is a digital assessment.
Well, and at this point, I need to sort of give Maggie some mad props, because she got something kind of started. I know she may not be ready to share this, but I'm going to share it because I'm proud of her. I think she did an amazing job. I think there was some thought about, or lack of thought probably, not through anybody's fault or anything, but just through the fact that it's just sort of the way we've always done things around the accessibility guidance for the new release of the new Iowa assessment tool. And given who she is and kind of the people she knows, Maggie was able to get that reconsidered, at least for our kids in grades, is it 6 through 12? And really give it a much more permissive lens to accessibility tools. And that's largely due to her advocacy. And so that one voice can make a difference. And so while Maggie did remarkable things there, and she deserves a lot of kudos and should have that, the larger message is that even one person can make a big difference in this game. And so, and that means that, and just to be crystal clear, we're talking about kids not being able to use tools that we would roll out universally in our curriculum in a standard way, particularly things like screen readers or text-to-speech, things like that. If the assessment isn't capturing our ability to decode, then why are we testing for it, right? And those are conversations we need to be having all the time. And that one conversation she had, this was one email, changed that, right?
Yeah, well, potentially.
I think it will.
The test comes out.
I think it will.
But I think that, the conversation can't stop with statewide assessments.
No.
We have district-wide assessments that are being administered to our students, and students are not being allowed, even though it's written on their IEPs, to utilize their tools. That's a problem. Not only like a problem instructionally relevant, just thinking about learner outcomes, but it's a problem legally. And so I think I would really, again, encourage district staff, teachers, if teachers are listening, to talk to your district staff about what are the protocol, what are the parameters by which we're allowing or not allowing our students to utilize their tools. It's about finding strengths and not finding weaknesses in students. And if we already know that a student struggles in reading and they're on an IEP, there's a lot of data to show that they struggle to read. Let's not keep testing them there. Let's see what they can.
Yeah, that was kind of the main point I tried to make in my session today, was that it has to be a mind shift away from what people used to view as intelligence, is what you can do without technology, just to what you can do, whether they're using tech or not. I mean, that's kind of the thing. I know people are still doing a lot of paper pencil tests, even in our district, and paper is never going to be as accessible as digital. It can't be, it's limited. And so they are automatically digging a hole for some people when you don't have another way to assess the learning. It doesn't have to be a test.
Well, as we've said before, I mean, assessments constructed in that way don't always do this, but oftentimes there's a test to get to the test, right? And so, particularly we talk a lot about this with math or with science, and that the first assessment is, can you read? Can you read the question? And you may well know the content, but you may not be able to access it because you have difficulty with the decoding part. And again, I'm not suggesting that decoding is not important. Everybody needs to learn how to decode, and that ought to be a forefront at all of our work. But we can't intervention our kids to death. And I'll get on that old high horse again, but we can't be throwing out interventions that are more significant than the core instruction we're doing. And then at the same time, creating impediments for those kids to access the content in these other areas. So again, I just think that's something that I feel so strongly about. And going back to it again, with our state assessment, I just think that's such huge news that there may be more permissive guidance coming on that. We'll keep our fingers crossed. But I guess what I would say to this is that if that permissive guidance doesn't come, ask for it. People are listening. It's not just, so we had one voice that hopefully made a significant change, but if it doesn't make the change, then it's going to have to be a collective voice saying this is unacceptable. we won't accept this guidance because we think it's morally and ethically wrong. And I think that's fair. And moreover to the point I think Maggie was trying to make first, particularly for IEP kids, it may be deeply ethically wrong in terms of the law. And so that's something to consider as well. What are other thoughts that you guys took away from the show today so far? I know you had a couple of really interesting conversations in your session, Patrick, about like you said, mindset around the tools that you were showing for your second session. I didn't make it to your first one. Your first one was a little too early.
Yeah, first session was Google Sheets, so it was just a lot of, hey, 40 people joined me to talk about Google Sheets at 8 a.m. on a Monday, so that was good.
I was there, but it was way over my head. I'm a beginner.
You got videos on the website. But I got to fix those closed captioning. One of the favorite things I was able to do for today was actually get the tactile Rubik's Cube. Finally got that ordered and delivered, and so it was fun. Because I love having that conversation in my session about how would you design a Rubik's Cube for somebody who's blind. And always attacking the thing somebody says Braille, but yet not many blind people will use Braille. So, and then if it's just Braille, then it's not available for other people. That's always one of my favorite things that comes up, and I can always guarantee one person will say Braille. But having that tactile Rubik's Cube is kind of cool to have in your hand just to see how it works and how anybody could use it who can do a normal Rubik's Cube or if they have a vision issue.
I thought that was a great moment.
Yeah, and I was glad it came. So I had to have that visual. And finally, Amazon had it, 2-day shipping, $15. I ordered it, no problem. Yeah. And I'm hoping to get my AirPods this weekend even possibly so I can make use of the live listening feature that they had in iOS 12 that I didn't know about to our last podcast, and that is just where you can use the microphone on the phone to send audio to the AirPods, so the Apple AirPods work with iPhones. So you can use it almost as a listening device. So like when I'm talking with somebody in a noisy background room, I can use that to actually hear them. And I'm really looking forward to testing it out, but Apple may be introducing new AirPods this week or next week or the weekend, sometime this month, so I have to hold off, and being patient with the tech purchase is never easy for me, even if the new one's really close around the corner and I already have it paid for, But that is something I'm hoping to try out now, because, AirPods, which a lot of people, I see a lot of our students have them, and I'm like, it's a feature built in now. It can replace, for a large part, some part, the functionality of hearing, which I'm kind of hoping to do because I like Bluetooth headphones, and then if it keeps me from needing a hearing aid at this point, then I'll use it when I need to.
Yeah, that's really cool. Maggie, you've got a session coming up too. Do you want to preview it a little bit?
Yeah. Core March is on. It's really about utilizing technology to design to the edges, thinking about technology tools. So it's really going to be talking a little bit of systems and a lot about tools and a little UDL as well. So it'll be a good session. Gina and Patrick.
It's on my to-do list today. I actually didn't look at the sessions for anything besides my own until lunchtime today, so I'd make sure to put that one on.
The graphics are cute too.
Yeah, well, you guys do a nice job with that all. That sounds awesome. So we have any final thoughts, because we're coming up on our 35 minutes here, which is about what we want to run for a show here. I just want to say that I thought the keynote today was remarkably thoughtful, and I thought rather bold for I'm trying to word this the right way. Maybe I'll just say it for a conference like ITEC. I mean, it was not the keynote I was necessarily expecting, and I mean that in all the best ways. Typically, and I've been involved with ITEC for a lot of years. And they've had great keynotes in, people I really love and still follow to this day. But this was one that I was like, this is really different, and I think that was really a cool thing. Because it's an issue that's becoming more and more sort of to the forefront, at least in my mind, and partially I'll own some of it. It's due to my context change because I'm thinking about things differently. But I think as we just look at Iowa and our population in general, I think there's something to be said for being more culturally aware.
And thank you to the ITEC board for having the podcast with Pavilion. This is a lot of fun to sit live with you too, and not through a computer screen. So thank you, and thanks for having us sit in. It's fun.
Yep, I definitely am going to I'm hoping this is one of the keynotes that they do share out the full things and share with our staff. I mean, iTech has done it sometimes when they get the releases. I know that. I've asked for past keynotes. I'm like, I want to show it to everybody. But we're making a big push in our district. We're talking about equity and cultural competency and going beyond that. And I think this will play perfectly in there. Hope, it's stuff I've been trying to push for, but I think he did a great job of explaining and saying everything, so being clear to people. So definitely hope we get to see this again.
Yeah, that would be great. So if we get those releases, we'll post those on our site as well. Thanks for the listen, everybody. We'll be back again, I think, in November. We haven't set the date yet, but we'll put it out here shortly once we do. We'll hopefully have another guest in to give us someone to talk to. Although I enjoy talking to these two, and I agree with Maggie. It's great to sit face to face in the same room with everybody. It's a little more fun than talking through a Hangout connection. So with that, we're going to wrap this episode up. Again, as always, thanks for listening. We hope you join us again in November. Take care.